All right, so this video is going to be covering a breaking story out of Louisville, Kentucky, where a couple has been put under house arrest after one of them tested positive. Crazy story. We're going to be covering it as much details as we have. And then I also am going to play some clips from an earlier episode of the show where we looked at the situation in Washington. They were very forthcoming with all of their crazy policies. And I think a lot of these policies exist in other states as well. It seems to mirror what we're seeing here in this Kentucky case. Let's go through the Kentucky case, and then I'm going to play some other clips after that in case anyone hasn't seen those yet. So the headline, and this is on ABC 7, actually does a good job of covering some government malfeasance here. This just came out today. July 19th, 2020. The headline reads, "Couple under house arrest after testing positive for COVID-19." Couple under house arrest. I know we all feel like we're under house arrest, but there's a photo here of them wearing ankle bracelets, tracking bracelets. So these people have it a little bit rougher than we do. What happened? Well, basically, one of them tested positive. Elizabeth tested positive because she was going to go visit her parents and maybe her grandparents. And it seems like a really nice family. I hate that this happened to them. So we all know that these tests are wacky and people are getting all sorts of results, and it seems like there's a concerted effort to make more of them come back positive for whatever reason. And that can be substantiated in a number of different ways. I mean, and maybe these are false rumors, but social media right now is inundated with people who say that they were doing tests where they didn't actually use the swab and it came back positive, or they missed their appointment and they got a call or a letter saying, or an email saying they tested positive. And it's just story after story. So she tested positive and didn't show any symptoms. So the health department contacted her, implying that this is standard policy. I wonder how many people this has happened to, because we heard at the end of May out of Washington some of the clips I'm going to play later. Some very concerning precedent being set up to take people away from their families, or just take them away from what they want to do into involuntary isolation, as they call it. So the health department reached out to her. I'm guessing she didn't reach out to the health department. So that means that whoever tested positive, whoever found her being positive, probably ratted her out to the health department, who contacted her requesting she sign documents, including her forfeiting her right to travel, it sounds like. And she said, I'll call you if I am going to leave my house for any reason, which sounds like what they were requesting her to agree to. But she chose not to sign, which I think should be applauded, because this sounds totally illegal, what the health department is trying to muscle her into doing for this minor situation. She doesn't have any symptoms. Come on. And it's not a very scary disease if you just look at the statistics, in my opinion. So they got a text message saying, because you refused to sign, this is going to be escalated and law enforcement will be involved. Sure enough, the sheriff came by later that week and talked to the husband, Isaiah, at their front door. Apparently 8 different people showed up, 5 different cars. There's a guy in a suit with a mask. It's the health department guy. They brought along 3 papers for each of the 3 people, the husband, wife, and daughter. The couple was ordered to wear ankle monitors. If they travel more than 200 feet, law enforcement will be notified. They didn't do anything wrong. They're treated guilty. and they have to prove their own innocence. And this doesn't even sound like they have that option. They never denied that they would self-quarantine. They just didn't like how the documents were worded, and they didn't want to sign away their rights. And I'm reading into it a little bit, because that's the problem with documents, is you can actually sign away your rights. So that's probably one reason why somebody would object. That's why I would object, among many reasons. So apparently a judge came into play, so I don't know if there was a case. There must have been a case ruled upon. The director of the public health department told the judge that Elizabeth was refusing to self-quarantine because of this, because she refused to sign. And she was like, that's not the case at all. She never said that. Then again, I mean, I think that she has an even stronger case because she even complied to do the so-called right thing and prevent the disease from spreading because she tested positive, although that's questionable whether she really was infectious and whether she really was infected, because these tests I really don't think have been calibrated and proven to be 100% correct. We keep hearing all these weird stories. Seems like there's also some conflict of interests that might be pushing the hand towards positive in many cases. So I just want to make the point that I don't think that people should have to verbally agree and then they can decline to sign a contract. I think people should just be able to decline. Although maybe I would maybe agree to, I mean, personally, I'd be fine, like they did, quarantining myself if I tested positive. Except I don't believe in these tests. And I think in the future this could be used politically. So it's not because I want to go infect people or even that I interact with that many people. I really don't. I just object to it on philosophical grounds. So they strapped ankle monitors on the couple. And that's where it stands. This is a news story from today. Now, I want to play some other clips. Here is Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer showing their hijacking and holding the economy hostage. And then we have the full, or I clipped a little bit of the boring parts out, but the Jay Inslee press conference out of Washington. Definitely check out some of that. If you get bored, just kind of skip ahead a little bit, or bail if you've already seen all the clips. But what do you guys think about this story? Couple under house arrest, strapped with ankle monitors, just for testing positive and saying, no, we're not going to sign a form. And we don't even know what was on the form. But check out this this expose where I go through some of the documentation I found in a deep dive into Washington law. And I think a lot of the state laws are similar. And it really mirrors what we saw here in Louisville, Kentucky. So thanks everyone for watching. Let's talk down below in the comments to hear what everyone thinks.
I wanted to talk just a little bit more about the isolation for families involved in this. If we could put up the isolation and quarantine graph just for a moment. So critical to the success of this endeavor, obviously finding people who are infected is important, but making sure that they care for themselves and that they do not infect other people is central to this. And that's the isolation and quarantine of this three-legged stool of testing, contact, tracing, and isolation. And there's 4 points to this I just want to share with people because it's so central to our success. Number one, we really need people to quarantine immediately upon their first symptoms and stay quarantined until you get a negative test result.
We had a great patriot named Ashley out of South Central Washington State sent us some pictures of campers being set up at the local Klickitat County Fairgrounds. And she just took pictures of it and then went and interviewed those folks and talked to them. And they were from search and rescue, but they were setting up what they called isolation centers that are, quote, mandatory for counties to move to the phase 2 of reopening in Washington state, end quote. And this raised all kinds of alarms. We've been talking about this danger for years at some of these so-called relocation centers that are part of the FEMA national shelter database could be used for nefarious purposes. And so we know that this was coming, that these could be used for nefarious purposes. And when I dug into it a little deeper, what I discovered it was that on the actual request form for voluntary quarantine, now I want to stop here for a second. Contact tracers are going to come to people's houses, and if they've identified somebody that has had COVID-19, they are going to now go to family members that may have had contact with them, and they're going to ask them a series of questions. And based on that, they're going to then request that they voluntarily quarantine. But here's the catch. At the bottom of the document, it says, quote, "If you do not comply with this request for voluntary quarantine, we may use a detention order enforced by the police to assure your compliance," which clearly doesn't sound very voluntary, right? And so the fact that these isolation centers, we now have confirmed that one is set up at the Spokane County Fairgrounds, are being set up at fairgrounds in Washington State. We're hearing that this is happening in other states. It's not a national policy, but seems to be part of this agreement that these governors have between these liberal state governments right now, is that this is conditioning Americans to have people come and question them, come and track them, come and have a guilty until proven innocence reason to take their kids from their homes, as our governor said. And our governor also said, if you can't safely quarantine at home, you will go to a facility of the state's choosing. We now know what those facilities are. This is real. It's confirmed. It's verified. It's happening in America right now. And I think it's part of this overall scheme to use COVID-19 for nefarious purposes.
DOH.wa.gov that said, oh, it's voluntary unless we decide that it's mandatory. So I went to this link from underneath that video we just watched. And look, it says, court order for involuntary isolation or quarantine. Likely to be used when you're not confident that individual will comply with the health officer order, or the local health officer believes that it may be necessary to move to a contempt of court proceeding with the threat of incarceration and or greater fine to secure the individual. Involuntary isolation or quarantine, both can be obtained, not mutually exclusive. It says here, when voluntary compliance was sought, but the individual refused or otherwise indicated that he or she won't comply, use the following forms, because that's what bureaucrats do. They make people's lives hell with forms. So if you have a hammer, every problem requires an annoying government form. So let's look at this. Let's look at these documents. We got the summons. To the respondents, a lawsuit has been started against you in the above entitled court by fill in the blank. In order to defend against this lawsuit, you must respond to the petition by stating your defense in writing and serve a copy upon the undersigned attorney for the petitioner within 20 days after the service of this summons, or a default judgment may be entered against you without notice. This summons is issued pursuant to Rule 4 of the Superior Court Civil Rules of the State of Washington. So I don't know if that's just like the cover letter. It doesn't seem to really tell them what the charges are. Let's look at this document here. Detention ex parte. Petition when voluntary detention refused. When voluntary detention refused, here's what you file against them in civil or criminal court. I don't even know. Partition for ex parte order authorizing involuntary detention for quarantine or isolation when voluntary quarantine or isolation is refused. So they just fill in these blanks. It's like Mad Lib. So they're giving all of these local health officers attorneys, I guess. And they're asking, this is a form asking the court to authorize involuntary detention for quarantine or isolation. It says here, factual allegations. The health officer has determined or has reason to believe that the respondent or respondents are or are suspected to be infected with, exposed to, or contaminated with fill in the blank, which could infect or contaminate others if respondents are not detained and quarantined and isolated. We requested that they voluntarily comply with isolation and quarantine requirements to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. Respondents failed to comply or refused to comply with infection control directives, including the directive for isolation or quarantine. So basically it says here, based on the above allegations as supported by the attached declaration, the health officer requests the following. Basically, they're asking the court to authorize involuntary detention of the people named from blank to blank. And they're also dumb enough to put 200 underscore when we're in the year 2020. And they think they're smart enough to decide who should be locked away. Bullshit. Bullshit. This could definitely be used politically, and we need to stand up against this entirely. So here it says, notice to respondents, you have the right to petition the Superior Court for release from isolation or quarantine. So guilty until proven innocent, right? They're just going to take you off to the internment camps, but you can petition to be released. It says here, I am the local health officer for fill in the blank. I am authorized by Chapter 70.05 RCW to take action necessary to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. Under RCW 70.05.070, RCW 43.20.0502D, and WAC 246.1000044, I am authorized to ask the court to issue an ex parte order for involuntary detention of individuals who should be isolated or quarantined to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. I am asking this court to issue an order involuntarily detaining the individuals named on the confidential schedule because they pose a threat to the public health, safety, and welfare for the following reasons. And that's the other thing. These aren't in the public records. They're going to be sweeping people up in the dead of the night, and nobody's going to know about it because it's not going to be subject to freedom of information. We have secret courts, like just out of Kafka's The Trial, and people are just going to get hauled away because they test positive in some bogus test. This is crazy. Well, at least the criminals, the tyrants, are showing themselves. On such and such a date, I asked the respondents to comply with voluntary isolation or quarantine to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. I took the following measures to obtain voluntary compliance. Yet the respondent has refused to voluntarily isolate. To protect the public, the respondent should be detained in isolation or quarantine for a period of fill-in-the-blank days, unless medical tests or other information conclusively establish that they are no longer a threat to the public health, safety, and welfare. This is obscene. It's just unbelievable. They put out this press release. This is the Washington State Department of Health, May the 15th. Statement on misinformation circulating about quarantine orders and facilities in Washington State. This is a statement from John Weissman, Secretary of Health, and Kathy Laffey, State Health Officer. They say they are aware of rumors and misinformation circulating about quarantine orders. So what misinformation are they talking about? Well, it seems like they're focusing on people's claims that these isolation and quarantine measures, when it's not possible for somebody to do that in their existing household or apartment, will result in quarantine internment camps. And they say here, our experience so far shows that the vast majority of people will follow our recommendations and isolate or quarantine themselves. However, all of these actions are voluntary and confidential, despite the misinformation being spread by some. So right here, they're claiming that isolation and quarantine is voluntary and confidential. But then right down here it says, the authority to involuntarily isolate or quarantine an individual rests with local health officers. So they're still claiming the authority, just at the local level. Each local health jurisdiction in Washington has plans and processes in place should involuntary isolation or quarantine be needed. So again, they contradict themselves. They're saying, well, we have our stuff in gear for these internment camps. We have plans and processes in place. We have our final solution. Should anybody not go along with the program and we need to involuntarily isolate them, they say they will only go this route as a last resort when someone is intentionally putting others at risk. Now, this, of course, could be applied to anybody who's not voluntarily quarantining themselves for 14 days or until they test negative. This is outright tyranny. And the contact tracers are really just government stalkers. Washington's Stalin over there says that they're highly trained. He has people from the Department of Licensing, which, if anyone's ever been to the DMV, we know that these licensors are some of the laziest people. And then also, he's bringing in the National Guard. He's trusting our private personal data to hired mercenaries and lazy, highly inefficient bureaucrats. What could go wrong there, right? Why don't we just not collect on a massive scale personal information that could be abused? I don't care if they signed a non-disclosure agreement. I don't care if they're with the National Guard. It's still my personal private information.
But what this is what this country needs. We need to have, we want to open our economy. To do that, we need testing, tracing, treatment, and isolation if necessary. So that's very important. This establishes a plan, a goal, a plan, benchmarks, and a timeline for us to get the American people tested so we know the size of this problem and again can defeat this villainous virus. Testing, tracing, treatment, and isolation. They say instead of doing something, they want to pause. Well, there's no pause in hunger or joblessness or not being able to pay the rent. The list goes on. American people are in pain. It's heartbreaking, the numbers of people who are dying and who are infected, and we have to address it. And we have to address it in a big way. And that's a big price tag, but the American people are worth it. As we go forward, we have to be based on scientists. Listen to that. This is the biggest disaster that our country has ever faced because it's a combination of economic downturn related to a pandemic. So in order to turn the economy around, we have to get rid of the pandemic. Science, testing, tracing, treatment, isolation, and to do so in a way that is, again, science-based with guidelines and the rest that will make the difference and protect the American people.
But there's a key thing missing in all this, and the business leaders he talked to, the political leaders, Democrat and Republican he talked to, all said it. It's called testing. If we don't have a strong, adequate testing regime, we're going to have real trouble. You have to know who has the illness, who's immune from the illness, and who could get the illness before we can determine who can go back to work and who can't. The testing regime is scattershot and totally inadequate for the job that's needed to get the country back to work. If we don't have the people who help out on the streets, the contact tracing, if we don't have the police and fire and EMTs who are needed here, it's not going to work. And you can't let this view government's no good govern, because government is the only place that can do certain things, such as preparing the country in advance for future problems. That's not business's job. That's not each individual's job. That is government's job.
Today we are announcing the COVID contact and tracing system and initiative in the state of Washington. We are excited about this initiative because it is the next major step in our effort, absolutely integral to our success. It is supremely important to our ability to reopen our economy and our businesses while simultaneously protecting our health. And I'm excited about the progress our state has made to date and looking forward to this discussion. We're joined today by National Guard Lieutenant Colonel Steve Hobbs, and I'd like to tell you about this initiative. It is robust, it is vigorous, and it is comprehensive, and it needs to be all three of those to succeed because of the vigorous effort of Washingtonians to socially distance, which has been very frustrating and difficult for us, but it has given us early success. It has given us the opportunity to continue this for some more time as we then transition into the contact tracing, testing, and isolation initiative that we are implementing. Our early days, we used social distancing. It's been frustrating, but it has been significantly effective. Now, as we attempt to transition to open back up our economy, we're simultaneously moving to this second initiative of testing, contact tracing, and isolation of people who in fact are infected. We think of this as a smart weapon against this virus. It's smart because it's located just to the folks and targeted for the folks who are positive, and if it's successful, it will allow us to reopen our economy. But this is something we have to be dedicated to, and today I want to share with you our dedication to that effort. Now, as we know at the moment, there are no treatments to stop the spread of this virus, but this is the smart weapon that is available to us. And I want to say, in some sense, this next stage, the testing, contact tracing, and isolation stage of this effort actually will be more difficult in a sense, and its success will depend on both the state and local public health officials, and most importantly, individuals and families who will need to be committed to this effort to help their community. If I can, let me just show you what this basically will look like. We think of the contact tracing initiative as an effort to box in the virus. We want to surround it where it can't get out of that fence and infect more people. It starts with the very first part of this is quarantining upon first symptoms. We need people to isolate themselves as soon as we get symptoms, including their household, even before test results come back. The second step is to test widely, and we are expanding our testing capability in the state of Washington so that we can test early and quickly and get those results to people as fast as possible. The third step is to isolate quickly. Certainly for people who are positive, we'll need to remain isolated and their families as well for 14 days. The fourth is to identify the contacts, and this is where we'll talk in some detail about our state efforts to be able to notify people who have had contact with a person who's been infected so that they can protect themselves, their families, and the community at large. And the fifth, of course, is to quarantine those people who've had contact who may be at risk even before that they have had a positive test. So that in general is the corral we want to put around this virus. This is going to be a partnership between our local health districts, which know the ground and know their communities, and the State of Washington Department of Health to bring both those levels of government to bear on this problem. So if I can start with the really first stage in this initiative, and that is isolation and quarantine. Now, this is maybe one of the most important things, and that is that we know that to prevent this virus from spreading, it is extremely important for people to isolate themselves at the very first sign of symptoms of COVID-19, even before they have tested. The same is true for their household. So we will then have people get their tests. And when they have a test, they will be reached by phone for the results. And at that time, they will be asked some questions about people with whom they've had contact who might have been infected by this virus. The contact tracer, and I'll talk about who those people are, they're very highly trained people, they will reach out to the other people to let them know that they have been exposed to a person in conditions that could result in their infection. And that's important because those people will need to isolate themselves and their families as well. Our plan, we hope to achieve the ability to contact people within 24 hours of a positive test coming back from the first individual and talking to their close contacts within 48 hours. So this has to be very quick to be effective, and it's one of the reasons we've properly resourced what's necessary to make this initiative work. It's very important to understand that this information will remain private. The information collected is only used by public health and it is confidential. It will not be shared. Contacts will not be told the name of the person who may have exposed themselves to COVID-19. These professional interviewers will ask about symptoms and recent exposure and demographic questions such as age, address, and gender and ethnicity. But this will remain private, and the people who were contacted will not know who the person was who provided their name. Now, to show how this will work, we wanted to show you who will be the contact tracers. This is a labor-intensive endeavor, and we want to make sure that we have enough resources to get this job done. It's a very heavy lift for the people working on this effort, and that's why we're building up the contact tracing team, which by the end of this week will have 1,371 people who are fully trained when that is necessary to get this job done. And this will include, to date, 351 members of the Washington National Guard, 390 members of the Department of Licensing who have been trained, the State Department of Licensing, and a combination of 630 state and local health department professionals who today are working for the local health departments or the state health department. These people are fully trained, and that's really important because we want to make sure that these folks respect the rights of privacy of the people involved and that they have a good sense about how to deal with the public who are sometimes very anxious about their results and the like. And we feel good about the training that has been provided to them. The people who do this work are very carefully screened, and they sign strict confidentiality agreements.
So, Mr. Mayor, are you willing to release all of those women from those non-disclosure agreements so we can hear their side of the story?
Now, some of the things they will not ask about immigration status, and I am looking forward to their work, because it is the thing that gives us an opportunity to have confidence to move forward to reopen our economy as we continue to build this effort.
You know, as from the very beginning, you've utilized the National Guard in dealing with this pandemic. And many of you should know that we live in your community. We are doctors, teachers, and construction workers, which is why we are so invested in reversing the spread of the coronavirus. That's why we are so pleased to support the Department of Health in its efforts to push the voluntary COVID-19 mapping program, the mission that we are currently doing. The Department of Health is a lead agency. We are using their equipment and we are staying in their facilities. And privacy is the utmost importance, which is why all data received and inputted is from the Department of Health's secure database. And as the governor said, all this is voluntary. We're only contacting people that have already agreed to be contacted, and the individual can end the phone call at any time. The members of your National Guard are highly trained in this effort. The Washington National Guard is ready to serve. This is a unique mission for us.
Well, it's been really inspiring. Those folks never get tired, at least they never show it, so please thank them on our behalf. And it's just great to have people who understand discipline and following orders. It's very important in this, so please thank them on our behalf.
Now that we're executing this plan, the need for a standardized and uniformed approach to case and contact investigation is more obvious than ever. Case and contact investigation is truly the heart of public health. It's learning how a disease got here and learning where it's going to go and trying to stop before it spreads there. That kind of work, interviewing our patients, our residents, our neighbors sometimes, takes a lot of time. And in a situation like a COVID-19 outbreak, time is of the essence. Time will make or break our chance of success for tackling this virus. So right now in our Emergency Operations Center, we're using paper. Our staff and our volunteers have to write down all of the information they get from our interviews, keep it secure, compile it all on paper. We continue to get the support from the state, helping us take that paper and get it into a database. We need ways to get it in there sooner, to be entering that information as we're gathering it, and for that information to make connections across jurisdictions, because this disease isn't stopping at our county's border. More importantly, we need the bodies to do that work. We need people, we need them now, because case and contact investigation needs to be done in real time for it to be effective. Now that we're in the midst of an outbreak, our number one limiting factor is truly time. The longer it takes for us to do this work, the longer COVID-19 is in our communities.
Thanks, Tristan. We know that with your outbreak, you're working really hard, and I'm glad we're going to have the state to provide you resources. We'll look forward to your call about how to really be an effective partnership right away. So I hope you're going to make sure you let us know how we can help Kittitas. And I'm glad we're going to have a uniform reporting system so that the state can be coordinated. I'm glad that we are working in combination with the University of Washington for an app that could be of assistance to people to find out if they have been in the proximity of people who are infected. That app could use some hardware, essentially, and software from Apple and Google. And this is a very promising technology that we are working with the UW on. We're going to make sure that if it is implemented, there's going to be the strictest privacy requirements because, of course, that's so important in this endeavor. I wanted to talk just a little bit more about the isolation for families involved in this. If we could put up the isolation and quarantine graph just for a moment. So critical to the success of this endeavor, obviously finding people who are infected is important, but making sure that they care for themselves and that they do not infect other people is central to this. And that's the isolation and quarantine of this three-legged stool of testing, contact, tracing, and isolation. And there's 4 points to this I just want to share with people because it's so central to our success. Number one, we really need people to quarantine immediately upon their first symptoms and stay quarantined until you get a negative test result. So if you have someone who has symptoms and their spouse then goes out and infects someone before you get a positive test, we've got another family that's in a very difficult situation. So this is something we have to depend upon the sense of commitment and compassion that Washingtonians have to make this work. The second point is that if people do test positive, they will need to isolate for 14 days, and that includes people in their household. So that means the household, the family, will need to isolate with them, and if a person cannot do that, there will be other isolation facilities for them away from their household, but we assume that the vast majority of people would rather spend those 14 days at home. And if they do so, we're going to have to make sure that the household also isolates with them, given the high transmission rate from one person to each household. A third, during that period of time, of course, a contact tracer will call and have a discussion about the other people that they've had a contact with to help those families. Fourth, and this is important, while that family or household is isolating, they will have support. They'll get a call or a text every day from someone to see how they're doing, see how their isolation is going. Again, I just want to thank people for what they've been doing to date in our state and what they're going to do as we move to the next stage of this challenge.
Hi, Governor. A couple of questions. First, is there a plan to hire more investigators beyond the 1,300 that are trained as of this week? And then as it relates to these investigations, Switzerland and New Orleans initially sought to require restaurants to take names and phone numbers of patrons for contact tracing purposes, but reversed course due to privacy concerns. Why did you make that a requirement rather than voluntary under the reopening guidelines for restaurants?
So yes, thank you for the question about hiring. We do intend to hire additional people and have volunteers to increase to at least some degree our capability over the next several weeks. We want to do that because we'd like to have a little bit bigger roster of folks in the event that we saw a spike in cases. We also would like to, over time, release some of the members of the National Guard back to their civilian duties. These are very accomplished people. So we will be involved in that in the next several weeks. And if people are interested, please let us know, because it's an important endeavor. The names issue is that we're trying to work with the industries to see what will make sense. This contact tracing, obviously, if you have somebody who's become sick and they were sitting right next to a person at a restaurant, to be able to identify that person could be very valuable for their health to try to save their life. And so we've put that in place. We're talking to the Restaurant Association. They think this may be tenable. We're continuing to refine this over time. And one way or another, we got to make sure we take care of people's health.
Each day, do you have enough contact tracers right now to trace every one of the cases being reported?
Yes, we believe that we do, and that's operative now. If local health departments call for these resources, they can be deployed. And I'm glad that we started this training some time ago to make sure it was available as we begin this transition. And I'm glad that we have that training that's already taken place. So yes, it is operative. Now, if we have spikes in this, it's possible that we would have to significantly increase our capability, but we have the framework to do that because we're able to do the training on a very expedited basis. We have a good protocol on how to do that. It's been very successful. And the people we've trained to date, they're ready to go. And so all we have to do is put them in the game if we get requests from the local health departments. They will make the request to begin with so that we can deploy these people out to the counties, to the places where they are most successful, or most needed, excuse me.
We've seen so many reports of businesses violating your orders to stay shut down, and so little enforcement we are seeing. So why should any businesses comply?
For people who finally won't comply, they're going to have to comply eventually. And if they don't, there are sanctions they will face, either in civil court or in criminal court. I spoke to the Attorney General about this today. We'll have more to say about this in the days to come. Well, June 1st is a hopeful date, but it is very important to understand it is not fixed in stone. The virus will determine whether we can start on June 1, and our ability to be successful in our social distancing and our contact tracing will determine whether we can take that next step in June 1st. And it's important to make that decision based on the extent and threat of the virus. We hope that that will be the case. The more that everybody in the state of Washington does to socially distance, to make decisions in their personal life, not to get into congregations of 10 people at a party, even on a sunny day, the more likely it'll be. But we cannot guarantee that.
Hi. If restaurants are going to be required to keep a list of customers coming in as they move into phase 2, will there be a requirement for customers coming into a restaurant to prove their identity, such as providing photo ID? And to follow up on that, would there be penalties if somebody was to give false information?
Well, we're talking to the restaurant owners about the things that might make sense to them. And so we'll have more to say about this, to have some workable thing. Look, here's the deal. We want to be able to open restaurants. People are anxious for that. And we want to do some common sense things so that if someone does have an infection in a restaurant, we will be able to save other patrons' lives. We ought to be able to do both. And this is something that we have to make sure that we build protocols around of privacy so that any of this information can only be used for this purpose, can be expunged after 14 days, so that this is only a minor inconvenience. No one's looking to make this a federal crime. We're trying to save some lives here. And I think that we're going to find ways to work together to do both.
Governor, just how realistic is this with contact tracing? We know the state's already having trouble dealing with unemployment claims. How can you expect to start reaching out to people who may have been exposed? And then a second question for you. What, if any, is the current plan to allow drive-ins to open?
I can't give you a specific answer off the top of my head on drive-ins, so I'll try to get back to you on that, on the specific, on drive-in theaters. Your question about how we can do this, the reason we can do the contact tracing is twofold. Number one, we've stood up an army, so to speak, or a fire brigade. Think of this as a COVID brigade. It's a brigade, it's kind of like a fire brigade. When you have a fire in your house, you call the fire department. They come, they put out the fire. We want to do the same thing for COVID, and we now have 1,391 people who on just a couple days' notice can be available to do what's necessary to do this contact tracing. This is more than adequate for the existing needs, but we want to continue to build that at least a bit so that we can have that available in case a spike occurs. And like I say, we've actually provided the training. And so I'm confident that we will have the resources to get this job done. But also, it's because we will, I think, have the assistance and agreement of Washingtonians, because I think they know how important this is. And like I said, the vast majority of Washingtonians have wanted to be a team member to get this job done. By the way, the National Guard, their function here is public health. They are not a law enforcement organization. So people should realize the Guard will not have any law enforcement obligations associated with this.
Thank you for contacting the Washington State COVID-19 Joint Information Center media line.
Hi, I'm calling about this press release that was put out of Washington State Department of Health. I find it quite amazing how it contradicts itself in the same press release. And you're calling other people, you're accusing other people of spreading misinformation. It says right here, all of these actions are voluntary and confidential, despite the misinformation being spread by some. And then at the bottom here it says, we have plans and processes in place should involuntary isolation or quarantine be needed. The authority to involuntarily isolate or quarantine an individual rests with local health officers. So I just don't know if we should really trust an organization that can't even put out like a 500-word press release without contradicting themselves in such an important aspect of this, whether you guys are going to have forced quarantine camps, internment camps for the sick. You guys, I mean, this is crazy. This is like FDR, Japanese, German internment camp level stuff. Can't believe this is happening in the United States.